The Ukrainian entered that house knowing the risks, but neither he nor the opponent hidden within the walls could have imagined the confrontation they would be forced into. Within seconds after a shootout, both were already on the ground, holding a knife that would be the decisive factor for the survival of one of them. But what led to one of the most brutal scenes of the war in Ukraine? How did the two survive to reach that situation? The story of the fighting reveals a lot about what led those men to fight for their lives, rolling and bleeding on the grounds of Ukraine. War is the purest brutality of man, distilled in the form of blood and fire. It is the valley of death where man sows and reaps the worst in his soul, whether to defend himself or to attack. There are indeed values, honor, and camaraderie where soldiers are able to create a brotherhood that differs from the concept of friendship. But that's not enough. War is a storm of violence, where virtues are mere flashes of lightning whose beauty lasts only for a fraction of a second, followed by the raw sound that announces their brief existence among the clouds. The battle in Ukraine marked these characteristics, one that was among the most brutal records of the fighting in Donetsk. This was the representation of what a soldier is subjected to in war, fighting for his survival, and where even what seem like flashes of mercy are the dirtiest image of human existence. This fight between a Ukrainian soldier and a Yakut fighting for the Russian Federation took place in 2024 during the conflicts for Trudovoy, south of Donetsk. At that moment, the fortress of Vuhledar further south had already fallen. It was a 2-year battle in which the Russians attempted several direct confrontations using armored columns that piled up as twisted metal and as large metal coffins for their soldiers. Moscow's strategy changed when they decided to try a new advance a little further north, towards Novomikhailivka. The battle for Novomikhailivka began in the fall of 2023 and ended in April 2024, with the city taken by the Russians and more than 320 of Moscow's armored vehicles destroyed around the ruins. The battles that took place were important for the Russians to advance, fighting against Ukrainian brigades like the 79th. Over time, important routes to Vuhledar were taken, helping to cut off support for the city. The Russian advance did not stop at Novomikhailivka, continuing until reaching cities like Trudovoy and culminating in this brutal record. It is then that the life of Dmitry Maslovsky enters the history of the conflict. His war name is Cobra, a fighter of the 79th Ukrainian Air Assault Brigade, who for months tried to stop the Russian advances in the region. On the other side in the assault waves was Andrei Grigoriev, born in Yakutia, one of the republics of the Russian Federation. It is necessary to understand what these men went through and what they survived in order to finally become protagonists of one of the most brutal records of the war. The Russian drone descended over the Ukrainian position near Antonivka. One of Kiev's artillery weapons was twisted by the explosion, turning into a handful of steel and flames in the middle of the field. It was still May 2024 when the Russians carried out this attack, trying to cover the 8 kilometers that separated Novomikhailivka from Antonivka. The Lancet drones were among their main weapons. These loitering munitions carried explosives to the Ukrainian positions as a powerful threat to the defenses in the region. A squad of Lancet operators was spotted by Kiev's observers. Kiev! That opportunity couldn't be missed. Therefore, one of the main weapons of this war, the high-mobility artillery rocket system, was activated. This artillery was one of the most famous in the battles, launching its missiles to blow up the entire squad that threatened the forces of Kiev. A Russian Buk M2 defense system was moved to the region precisely to try to intercept Ukraine's unmanned aerial vehicles. The drones were very effective spies for both sides of the war. Sometimes the Buk managed to destroy this equipment, but at a certain point it fatally failed and was identified by the lenses of the 120th Ukrainian Territorial Defense Brigade. The mistake led the Kiev troops to issue orders to end the activities of the Buk M2 in the area, turning it into a cloud of smoke. The wreckage was scattered across the field, mixed with the bodies of the Russian operators. The Russian columns could not be absent from the succession of attacks. The process was quick, with forces like the 39th Motorized Rifle Brigade and the 33rd Motorized Rifle Regiment approaching the Ukrainian defenses around Antonivka. They didn't use large columns like the ones that occurred in Vuhledar. The small groups of soldiers were transported successively by armored vehicles, many of them covered with extra protection. Men like Andrei Grigoriev climbed onto the armored vehicles and began to be sent against the Ukrainian positions. They were met by artillery and kamikaze drones while still on the way. Some powerful strikes caused these vehicles to go out of control and crash into the trees. The soldiers disembarked under artillery fire. Tanks and transports were destroyed. Wounded men applied the tourniquets in the midst of fire and smoke to stop the bleeding. Some of them were hit by drones. One of the wounded, who managed to stop the bleeding in his leg, tried to move away along the road. But the drone plague ended his escape. Dmitry Maslovsky was in the trenches, watching anxiously as the Russians got closer and closer, with their waves turning into fire. But there was always another wave that came over the metal corpses. The persistence led a squad to land near the tree line, preparing them to begin the assault on Dmitry Maslovsky's position. Luckily for the Ukrainian defenders, the Russians were punished by artillery fire landing at their feet. A pair managed to get close to the defenses of Antonivka, but the alert soldier from the 79th got out of the trench to empty the entire magazine of his Automat Kalashnikova 74 at the two survivors. Russian shelling once again plagued the lives of Ukrainians in Antonivka. They fell in such numbers that smoke and debris spread exponentially. Ukrainian lives have been disappearing from Antonivka. The 79th Air Assault Brigade was cornered within its defenses and began preparing to retreat. Dmitry had no peace even after leaving the trench, forced to live with the constant shelling. Russian drones flew over the city like a swarm, dropping grenades on houses or on soldiers who had to move in search of new shelter. The destabilized defenses were unable to stop the entry of Russian squads into the city. Andrei Grigoriev, a survivor of the waves thrown against Antonivka, finally arrived to begin clearing the place. These troops entered carefully, always in groups. The defense still had an advantage, being able to surprise him while hidden behind barriers. At a certain moment, the shots came from the window. The Russians responded quickly, keeping fire on the Ukrainians. The group's suppression saved them from being torn apart in the open field by the defenders' gunfire. They were circling the house when the explosion of a grenade tore through the flesh of one of their own, who wasn't fast enough in the advance. The other two saved him with more suppression. The squad tried to surround the house to finish off the Ukrainian, but a well-protected soldier was enough of a threat for three who were completely exposed. They had to stop to carry their wounded comrade. The use of artillery and drones ensured that these defenders suffered from the explosions. Those who weren't wounded were cornered in their hideouts. The Bears continued with the clearing operations. Grenades were thrown into attics and bathrooms to flush out the Ukrainians still hiding. The Automat Kalashnikova shots did the same thing. Sometimes they still had to enter the houses shooting to finish off whoever was inside. Antonivka fell in November 2024 according to the Russians. Andrei Grigoriev traveled thousands of kilometers from Yakutia or the Sakha Republic to get to Ukraine. He spent from May to November covering the 8 kilometers that separated Nova Mikhailivka from Antonivka, seeing comrades from the 39th fall on the battlefields or return home in black bags. Even so, Russia's steady advance in 2024 is undeniable. The fighting continued against the next cities. It was already December 3rd when the Russians got out of their armored vehicles near Antonivka and were hit by a grenade from a drone right in the middle of the squad. The kamikaze drones destroyed their transport vehicle, preventing retreat and the evacuation of the wounded. One crew member escaped, lying on the ground, breathing the toxic smoke released by the flames. The drone dropped an explosive on him, delivering a hidden death amid the air blackened by the destruction of the armored vehicle. He was seen crawling through the special lenses. That's where his life ended for good. Another crew member was also found under the hot metal. An explosive sent shrapnel flying at him, tearing his life apart. One of the men who managed to reach one of the buildings was chased by drones until he was finished off. Just 2 days later, the Russians launched another one of their armored attacks against the Ukrainians. Starting from the north of Antonivka, Andrei Grigoriev saw some of his comrades go into combat against the 79th Brigade of Ukraine. They had 9 kilometers to cover from Antonivka to the new objective. The fighting began in early November, but in December the Russians increased the number of attacks. The explosions began to consume the armored vehicles, putting the soldiers from Moscow in a desperate situation in the midst of the fire. Some of them tried to escape from the drones that appeared to end their lives. Those hiding among the armored vehicles were blown up in new attacks. Crawling among the useless metal in the snow-covered field was no use. The fire came to incinerate the Russians in yet another day of combat. The next day, on December 6th, there were already 4 Russians walking along the tree line toward the Ukrainian positions. One of Kyiv's drones found them. They even tried to shoot at the aerial threat, but the gunfire didn't stop the explosive from dropping. The impact blew off one of their heads. The other wounded fell along the tree line. Each one received their grenade. These explosives detonated the Russians' extra ammunition. Their bodies were gradually consumed by the flames during the cold Ukrainian winter. The Russian assault was marked by an unbeatable persistence. Their squads kept coming all the time. By December 9th, there were already more of them landing in Antonivka. Almost always in small groups, they ran towards the houses. When they felt safe, they came out to continue on their way through the village. The drone was just waiting to launch the first explosive. It didn't land exactly between them, but the shrapnel knocked everyone to the ground. The final explosions completely consumed the lives of the Russian soldiers. But even with those losses, the pressure continued. They were getting closer. Another squad with 4 members was detected. This one was hit directly by a kamikaze drone. A single explosion, and the existence of all of them was reduced to ashes and shadows. And military police landed his troops near a building. The group was shelled by Ukrainian artillery shortly after. With no time to leave, the transport succumbed to a new impact that made the metal give way with a deafening crack. The Russian presence increased considerably in Antonivka. There were more soldiers from Moscow appearing among the houses. The kamikaze drones chased them into their hideouts. Those demons searched for every life squeezed in between the buildings. Many of those soldiers took the hot punch from the drones. The kamikazes persisted in their dives against the Russians. The explosions grew throughout Antonivka. Even so, the Ukrainians couldn't prevent the waves of Russians from coming in. Another column appeared to try to take over the city, giving more strength to the Russian soldiers who were already there. It was already December 15th with a succession of attacks happening within just a few days. The waves didn't stop, usually with small groups that wore down the Ukrainians. This column was a bit larger but ended up meeting the same fate in the fields. A soldier forgotten in the snowstorm saw the drone watching him. Alone in that cold vastness, he contemplated death. The first explosive hit him directly, leaving him struggling to breathe on the frozen ground. After successive falls, he bled as the fire began to consume his ammunition. The flames grew until they consumed his flesh. He was yet another whose body would never be mourned by his family. The Ukrainian resistance held out for another 2 weeks in December. Wave after wave, the Russians kept getting closer. 2 soldiers from the 155th Motorized Rifle Regiment approached one of the buildings defended by the Ukrainians. They used the TNK anti-tank mine inside the building. They ran away before the 12-kilogram explosive detonated, taking all the hidden defenders with it. Dmytro was not among the 79 soldiers killed in Intensifying. He had another mission a little before that, fighting for another territory. Russian tanks fully entered Intensifying on December 18, 2024. Their cannons filled the village with smoke. The explosions wiped out what was left of the Ukrainian forces that couldn't evacuate. These armored vehicles roamed freely among the houses, hunting for more threats to eliminate. Andrei Grigoriev did not take part directly in this battle. He fought a little further south when his troops, the 39th, began the siege to finally seal the fate of the Ukrainians in Intensifying. On this path was Trudovoy, a little further south where Dmitry Maslovsky and Andrei Grigoriev would meet. Trudovoy was under Russian control when the Ukrainians decided to launch a counterattack. Drones began a series of attacks against enemy hideouts. The pilots of the small aerial demons from the 79th Jagger Brigade unleashed a storm of fire on Russian positions on November 25, 2024. Explosions at sites scattered in and around Trudovoy. At some point after that, between the end of November and the beginning of December, Ukraine's 79th Brigade launched an assault on the village. Meanwhile, 2 Russians used a motorcycle to carry their flag to the village, making it clear who it belonged to now. They were surprised by drone attacks that destroyed their vehicle. One of them escaped unharmed, but the other was injured and slow, becoming an easy target for the drones. The survivor saw his friend burn while he ran into a house and hid. A Ukrainian soldier arrived shortly after. Dmitry Maslov pointed his rifle into the yard of the residence, looking around the wooden fence while waiting for orders on the radio. Apparently there was a Russian there. Alone against a man with full defense, it was unlikely he would succeed in the attack. That's why he waited for the drone to arrive. Dmytro heard the sounds of explosions in the background, trying to keep his focus on the threat inside, but still fearing he might be surprised by another Russian. Being alone in that environment was a big mistake, but he had orders to follow and support behind him. He moved away when he heard the buzzing of the drone. The hope was that it would end the Russian's life. The aerial weapon detonated over the house. Smoke and dust covered the yard, now full of debris, for a moment. Ukrainian received orders over the radio to check the result, which made him walk through difficult terrain in an open position. The debris distracted him for a second. That gave enough time for the face inside to shoot at him. Dmytro reflexively fought back as best he could. He pulled the trigger, while none of the enemy's projectiles pierced his body or splattered blood onto his exposed hand. He fell while trying to shoot. The blood flowed almost as quickly as his fingers squeezed the trigger. He ended up stumbling over the obstacles, already dazed from the wound. He pulled out a grenade to throw it inside the house. He got up quickly and threw the explosive into the room, already without his rifle. The grenade exploded inside, but the Russian was already outside, aiming his rifle at the corner. After the first shot, the Ukrainian lifted the opponent's weapon. For the first time, he saw the man's face with the features of a Yakut, one of the ethnic groups of the Russian Federation. Andrei Grigoriev and another person pushed each other, fell to the ground, and a knife was drawn. The deadly weapon was fought over by the hands of the Yakut and the Ukrainian. It cut fingers as it slipped from one to the other. The Yakut beat like a beast. trying to snatch the weapon from the Ukrainian. Both were already covered in the Kiev soldier's blood when Yakut finally managed to take the knife and gain the upper hand. Knowing his life was on the line, the Ukrainian grabbed the blade, feeling it slice through the skin of his fingers, but he didn't let go. Yakut bit down, trying to force the fingers open. Andrei saw a fallen Ursil Hassan nearby and grabbed it, holding it firmly and stabbing the pointed end into Dmitri's left eye. The soldier from Kiev tried to protect himself, but the pain was sharp, the blood drained, and not even adrenaline or desperation could keep his strength up to fend off the attacks. The enemy pressed him to the ground and struck his neck. Twice the man was stabbed. To be stabbed. Finally, the Ukrainian looked at Andrei and asked him to stop. He surrendered. Defeat, he asked to rest and to be left alone.
And that's it, Mom. Goodbye. Wait, let me die in peace. You cut my whole body. Let me breathe. It hurts a lot. Let me go in peace. Don't touch me. It's over. Let me die. Don't touch me. Let me die. I want to go alone. You were the best soldier in the world. Goodbye.
All he wanted was to die, seeing the sky for the last time, saying goodbye to his mother. Having recognized that his opponent was better, he thought he would be left in peace. Yakulto had already gotten up and started gathering his things. Strangely, he hid behind a door and threw a grenade at the Ukrainian, denying him his last request to say goodbye. Andrei Grigoriev. He told the story to the Russians as a hero, even about the fact that he threw a grenade at the fallen enemy. Strangely, some Russian groups decided to change the story about this, claiming that the Ukrainian used the weapon against himself. The footage was recovered by the Russians and released on social media weeks later by themselves. The cameras captured the brutality of war in its essence. When a man fights despite the pain, when the blood drains away but the need to survive compels him. It also showed how even the last seconds of a bleeding, surrendered man's life on the ground can be denied. Grigoriev claimed he threw the grenade out of mercy, after he himself had stabbed his opponent's neck twice and heard from him words about his victory and that life had been better in combat. Dmitri died with his last gaze fixed on the sky of his country, interrupted by the Russians' final act of violence. One's last wish, the other's mercy or ruthlessness, interpretations may vary. But what is most clear in these images is that those two men were thrown into a brutal situation by decisions made by someone whose knowledge of violence was always tied to giving orders, never to carrying them out. Andrei Grigoriev survived wave after wave during those days of advance until he was subjected to that fight. Meanwhile, someone dressed in a suit would give a speech on television about his bravery and how it represented his country. That person is so far removed from those men bleeding on the ground with a knife in their hand that he is able to confuse the brutality of war and the sheer need to survive with bravery. But that's how men are on the road of life, where the powerful walk over corpses, listening to the applause of those who have been lucky enough not to have had to experience this so-called bravery for the sake of their leaders yet.